Dr. Tedeschi, I have given you rights to share your PTG slides, sir. So,
Okay, all right. I can start the slideshow whenever you're ready.
okay. Yeah, feel free to go ahead and do that. I'm just allowing people into the room right now. We'll get started in a moment. And I believe OSTOP is here to provide translation as well. And in a moment, I'll give instructions to folks on how to utilize it.
You see my slides okay?
Not yet.
Good morning. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Dr. Orton, I can hear you. Thank you.
Well, it's 7:59 by my US Central Time Zone clock, so we'll wait another minute, get everything ready, and then I'll introduce you if that's okay, Rich and
That will be
Lena.
fine.
Yes, absolutely.
It'll be a short introduction, so we can spend more time listening to you.
Okay, let me know if you can see the slides yet.
Yes, sir. Understanding and facilitating PTG.
You got it.
Okay. Lena, Rich, are you ready for me to start the introduction? Or should we wait?
I'm ready anytime you are, Steve.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone from Dallas, Texas, United States. My name is Steve Orton, and I'd like to introduce you. I'm with Leap Global Missions, and on behalf of Leap Global Missions and Craig Hogar, our founder, and on behalf of Lena Denman of the Arlene Campbell Humanitarian Foundation, we'd like to welcome you to this lecture by Rich Tedeschi. Dr. Tedeschi has studied probably more than or as much as anyone in the world about trauma and how we can navigate trauma well. And in the 1980s, Rich began studies with trauma patients and noticed how many trauma patients came through with with growth and a greater strength of character and mental emotional wellness than they were before. Currently, Rich Tedeschi is professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and he's one of the foremost leading experts and coined the term post-traumatic growth. And so what the Arlene Campbell Foundation and Leap Global Missions is very much involved in Ukraine, and we've met many people who we felt like could benefit from Rich's understanding of trauma and how we grow stronger because of it. So thank you very much to all who've joined us from Ukraine and around the world. And also thank you, Rich Tedeschi, for joining us today and being willing to help us understand and facilitate post-traumatic growth in anyone who experiences trauma.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm honored to be here and to try to provide some assistance through this presentation today to people in Ukraine who are suffering so much in this war, and hopefully, as we go through this presentation, you'll find something here that will help you and your communities manage this situation, and like Steve was saying, come out stronger in some ways that are very valuable to you. And I thank you, Steve and Lena, for inviting me. So I'm going to go through these slides in this presentation, and hopefully at the end we'll have a few minutes to take some questions if you have some. And we also present at the end some places you can go to through the Boulder Crest Institute that I work for to find out some more information. So the first thing that I want to do is tell you what we've got in store for you today. We're going to look at trauma and post-traumatic growth in terms of how to understand it, the definition of it, the process that people go through over time that yields post-traumatic growth, and how to facilitate that process and how you can be helpful for other people in being what we call an expert companion. So let's look at an overview of trauma and post-traumatic growth. In mental health, we have been used to thinking about trauma in terms of symptoms, and we diagnose it in terms of symptoms of trauma, things that people report when they suffer through trauma, and we treat it by trying to attend to those symptoms and reduce those symptoms, which are so disturbing to people. But we have a little cartoon here that shows that everybody is different, and it's hard to make judgments about people in their trauma experiences by just attending to the symptoms and applying to those things one particular way of trying to treat them, because everybody's experiences are so different. And in mental health, we use these criteria to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. And we decide if there was a significant enough stressor, a person has to be exposed to death or threatened death or serious injury. These kinds of stressors are determined to be the kinds that yield post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we look at symptoms like intrusive thoughts, how many people are thinking things over and over again that they can't get out of their minds, that they avoid certain situations that remind them of trauma, that they think negatively and they feel negative things, and they are easily aroused by events like loud sounds and things of that sort. So these are the symptoms that we pay attention to in order to make these diagnoses. So that's the typical way we operate in mental health traditionally. But we've learned a lot about how people respond to trauma in all sorts of ways. And the idea of resilience has entered the mainstream of psychological thinking. And we know that people often do well in the aftermath of traumatic experiences. People sometimes do not show much disruption to their lives. Some people have the ongoing distress of post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress injuries. But we also know now, and as Steve mentioned, I've been looking at this for decades now, that some people are exposed to trauma, but experience a positive transformation after that. And that's what post-traumatic growth is. So let's look at a different way of thinking about trauma that will allow us to think in terms of growth. So we need to understand trauma from the survivor's point of view. We need to know what they went through and what their experience was. That's important. People who are companions with them, who are experts at being companions. And therefore, when we listen to their stories and understand them from their point of view, we can identify possibilities and aspirations for growth. So we can think about trauma in a different way, especially from a cognitive point of view. That is, how people think about what happened to them. And trauma is a severe challenge to the person's ways of understanding their world, their place in it, and their personal identity. What's been happening to them in traumatic circumstances is that they no longer feel that the world makes sense. They
Sorry, Rich, you have become muted. So if you could unmute yours, and everyone else could please mute your mic so that we can hear Dr. Tedeschi without interruption. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Rich, we can hear you now.
I don't know how that happened. I'm sorry. I have no idea. Okay. So the ways that our thinking changes is that um, our world that we've assumed to be has been challenged or shattered. And the things that we usually assume to be are things like how safe we are, how benevolent the world is, how predictable events are, how much control we have over things, how vulnerable we are, our sense of our own self-esteem, and our morality, the morality that we take to the world and the world shows to us. And sometimes in traumatic circumstances, we find ourselves doing things that seem to be against our moral code, or we are watching the world operate in a way that is against our moral code. And this is a shattering experience. So when all of these assumptions that we usually make are called into question, that is traumatic for people. So this set of assumptions needs reconstruction. Traumatic events are things that can damage these core beliefs that we have, just like a disaster can damage a city, an infrastructure of a city, the buildings, the electric grid, the uh, sewer system, the water system, everything that the city needs to run, the infrastructure that supports it. We have a cognitive or psychological infrastructure, the set of core beliefs that we use to operate in our lives, and we have to reconstruct that set of core beliefs so that we can operate again, that we can live again. So we need to somehow develop a new infrastructure that makes sense in this terrible new reality that we've faced. Another way to think about trauma is in terms of a narrative. We are all telling ourselves the stories of our lives. We're thinking about ourselves through time as developing in a certain direction, and we have a plan for our lives, how it should go, and trauma is a turning point in that narrative, the disruption of that anticipated course of life. So the event often divides life into a before and after. Before these events, after these events. When people tell their stories like that, they're usually telling a story of trauma, but these can be turning points that can be growth enhancing as well. Can turn people in a new direction, on a new life story, a new life path or narrative. So if we define post-traumatic growth as a process of going through this change in narrative and reconstruction of core beliefs, we can think about also the outcome of this process as a positive change in oneself as a result of the struggle with traumatic events. And this is a struggle. We emphasize that this is no easy process to reconstruct this core belief system and find some kind of positive outcome is not easy. It's a struggle over time. And these are transformative changes in perspective. No simple and easy process and no simple or easy changes. These are major changes in how we understand ourselves and our lives. These changes in perspective we see are what we call post-traumatic growth. And when we've done research from people who are experiencing post-traumatic growth, we recognized in their stories that they've told us that there are 5 different ways that people experience growth. One is they see new possibilities or opportunities in their lives that they hadn't seen before. And that's sometimes because certain opportunities or possibilities are now shut down and they're no longer available to them and they have to go to a new direction. They're forced into some new path. They relate to others in a way that shows greater connection, compassion, empathy, willingness to be open. deepening relationships with other people, often because, again, this has become necessary as they've tried to survive these traumatic events. Because people are first interested in surviving, and then in an attempt to survive, they may band together with other people or rely on other people, or other people help them, and this deepens their relationships. They also find that in order to survive, they have to do things that they never thought they would be able to do when they start to identify personal strength they didn't know they had. And they also come to appreciate life in a way that maybe they didn't before. They might have taken things for granted, and they are living a life of greater gratitude. And they often experience spiritual change and existential change as they try to confront the question of what their life is supposed to mean, and why live life through all these difficulties and all this suffering, what the purpose might be, and how they can turn their lives towards a greater purpose than they had before. So these are the kinds of things that we find in post-traumatic growth, these kinds of changes. And people don't experience necessarily all of these things, and maybe one or more of these kinds of changes. Now, this is not a new concept, even though myself and my colleague Lawrence Calhoun, we coined this term back in the 1990s. It's something that, of course, has been in the wisdom literature of the great religions and stories and literature across time and cultures, because it's the human story of what we've done as human beings with the suffering that we've confronted. Human beings have confronted suffering ever since the beginning of humanity. So, for example, here's a quote from a Christian evangelist, Billy Graham, who wrote on suffering that it tends to plow up the surface of our lives to uncover the depths that provide greater strength of purpose and accomplishment. Only deeply plowed earth can yield bountiful harvests. A wonderful metaphor for what we're talking about in post-traumatic growth. And sometimes we need to talk in terms of metaphors like this, because it's a profound experience that's very difficult to articulate, to explain to other people. So metaphors are sometimes useful in this regard. And we find it in Islam, as trials and afflictions are said to prepare us better for a journey heavenward. We find it in Buddhism and the Noble Truths that address the problem of suffering in life. We find it in existential psychology, the writings of people like Erich Fromm or Viktor Frankl, Frankl being a Holocaust survivor who wrote remarkable accounts of how he and others managed to live through the Holocaust. Now, resilience is a concept that you might be more familiar with in post-traumatic growth. It's become very popular. So let me make some distinctions between resilience and post-traumatic growth. Resilience is the ability to recover readily or resistant to adversity. And post-traumatic growth, we're not recovering readily, and we're not resisting it. We're deeply affected by trauma and suffering. We're deeply affected because of those deep effects. We need to reconstruct our belief system, and therefore we have to go through a process of struggle. So people who are resilient aren't really struggling. They're just able to manage things. People who go through post-traumatic growth have gone through great struggle. And so as a result, in post-traumatic growth, we get transformative responses to this adversity rather than resistance to it. So let's look at the process that people go through. First, we have this core belief system, the assumptive world that I mentioned, that everyone holds in one way or another. There are individual differences in this regard, what you believe and what you rely upon to guide yourself through life. And they're culturally influenced to some degree, of course. We learn it through our families, our communities, our greater culture. And then we confront a potentially traumatic event, a seismic event, one that's like a psychological earthquake, like the one that destroys a city. And if the core belief system provides a context for that event, it's not so emotionally distressing because we understand it, it makes sense, and we're resilient. But if those core beliefs are challenged or shattered, it's very distressing. And we experience emotional distress because the core beliefs don't leave us with a way to really understand what we're going through. And we are prone then to intrusive rumination. That is, we have these automatic intrusive thoughts about things like, what's happened? I don't believe this has happened. I can't believe this has happened to me. Why did this happen to me? They can't make sense of it. And you ask these kinds of questions and are confronted with these thoughts again and again as you're trying to figure out what this process is that you're now involved in. And you have to then reflect on what's going on. You have to analyze yourself and say, what's happened to me? Who am I? Who am I now? You might reflect in those ways and write some things, maybe a journal or a story of what's going on. You might pray, or you might talk with other people and disclose to other people. You feel compelled to tell the story, perhaps, especially with someone who's gone through the same kinds of things you've gone through. You might be open to those kinds of disclosures and discussions with people who you think will understand. And you have to also find a way to manage your emotional distress and redirect all that rumination and reassess your goals in life to get back on some kind of track that makes sense to you. Because to be left with all this confusion and anxiety is just intolerable. Hopefully, if you find the right kind of support, the kind of people who show you a little bit of the path forward, who demonstrate growth in their own lives, or if you can rely on the social and cultural and themes of growth that you might find in your belief systems around you, then you can start to turn to a way of thinking, a rumination that's more deliberate and reflective and constructive, and start to revise your own story and think ahead about what the story of your life is now becoming and where you can take it, what kind of authoring you can do, what kind of writing you can do in your own life about your story, so that you can start to accept the fact that this world is different now. Your life has changed. And as you try to figure out the ways it has changed and where this can take you, your distress is mitigated to some degree. But it's still there because you've been through terrible things and you've lost a lot. But in the midst of all that, you can still start to see some possibilities for yourself that you might not have considered before. These 5 possible ways that you can grow in the aftermath of these experiences, or even while these experiences are still happening to you, whether you're a person who is continuing to deal with a severe illness like cancer, for example, or who has been disabled in some way, who is still going through some terrible circumstance like the war in Ukraine that you're going through. So in the midst of all of this, you start to reconsider your life and the path of your life and start to see these kinds of changes in yourself when you have the proper kind of support. And with that comes the more resilient version of yourself that's now developing out of this, the personal strength that you're starting to find, maybe even wisdom for how to live life well, and a way of living that allows you to benefit other people through some acts of service that you think are now important and meaningful and purposeful for you. We have ways of measuring this. We have different measuring instruments that we've developed so that we've done research on this through the years with many, many people, thousands of people literally. And these research projects have expanded throughout the world. And the post-traumatic growth inventory that we use has been translated into more than 24 languages. And we find then that this experience of post-traumatic growth is something that is found across cultures and across the world. We also have a way of measuring the change or shattering of the core beliefs and what people then have to figure out through this reconstruction process that I've described. And we have a way of measuring how people ruminate in ways that are intrusive or more deliberate. Now, in order to facilitate the process of post-traumatic growth, we need expert companions. They're very helpful in helping people go through this process, this struggle that we mentioned, in a way that is more fruitful. And it's a process that is an integration of the ways that we have traditionally approach trauma in mental health circles. It's a way that integrates an existentialist point of view, a cognitive point of view, the narrative point of view, constructivist point of view. But the core of it is a relational model of expert companionship, because at the core, we have to approach people with humility and a way of listening to their stories that changes us, rather than thinking that we are the experts on them. We have to learn how to be conversant with their story and know what it is that they have gone through, rather than assuming that we know better and we're going to do something to them to change them. And in this way, this post-traumatic facilitation process is different from a lot of the mental health treatments that we're familiar with when it comes to trauma therapies and PTSD therapies. And there are 5 phases of this process: education, regulation, disclosure, story, and service. And we'll talk about each one, but at the core is this way of relating, listening, and approaching people with humility that I need to learn about them and their experience. So the first phase is education. And you find this in many trauma-focused therapies. We need to help people understand how their shattered belief system is a foundation for post-traumatic growth, and that what they're going through in their bodies and their minds are normal responses to trauma. Their bodies are just doing the things that bodies do when they're experiencing such threats to oneself. And we are doing things in our minds to try to understand what's happening to us. These are normal responses, and they don't indicate that there's anything essentially wrong with you. They're a normal response to an abnormal situation. And then we have to help people regulate their emotions. So people's sympathetic nervous system responses that are normal responses to trauma have now been sensitized to an extent that they're overreacting to all kinds of things that may not be threats to them anymore. And we have to help them find ways to regulate that sympathetic nervous system. And this is where all kinds of breathing techniques, meditation techniques, progressive muscle relaxation techniques, guided imagery, and all of this can be helpful in helping people regulate their emotional responses, and to then help them move to a more reflective or deliberate way of thinking about what they've been through, rather than endure intrusive rumination. And then we have to help people disclose, talk about, express in some way what they've been through, so they're not just in their own cave hiding in their traumatic circumstances. So we help people tell their story, but not just the story of the traumatic events, but what's happening to them now in the aftermath of trauma. And that's different from a lot of other trauma-focused therapies. And we have to deal with what we call the counterfactuals, the wishes that people have that these things have never happened, and what they might have been able to do to try to prevent some of what has happened to them. This is where people sometimes get stuck, and they feel guilty and they wish they had done something different, or they just can't accept the fact that these things have happened. We have to help people learn to use their connections with other people to help them figure out who to reach out to that might be good expert companions, someone who's going to listen to them, tell their story, especially help them in the aftermath of all this to move into a more positive direction in their lives. And we help people think through when they feel most understood by other people. Uh, what what gave them a feeling of being understood, um, and when sometimes they felt misunderstood, and what gave them this impression. So picking the people in the environment who are the understanding, expert listeners, and those who may not do a good job of that um, is something that you can help people with. And in this way, as people learn to disclose, they start to create a new narrative about their life and the growth domains that they might be noticing in themselves. Um, you can help people organize the story of the trauma into a narrative that makes sense, uh, and listen for the elements of post-traumatic growth, and help people appreciate the paradox involved in this story. Because post-traumatic growth is essentially a paradox of how out of loss comes gain. But there are other paradoxes that evolve too in this story. That when you accept support from other people, you start to feel actually better able to rely on yourself, to recognize your own strengths and capabilities. And when you recognize that there are things that you can't control, you get a greater sense of being in control of your life. And when you're able to recognize your losses, you might be more grateful for what you still have. And when you recognize your vulnerability, that is a strength, because then you can make sure that you have ways of protecting yourself. And out of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that we talked about at the beginning, we can still experience post-traumatic growth. They coexist very often. But the growth, the meaningful life that you have ahead of you, can help mitigate the impact of those post-traumatic stress symptoms. And we certainly find that in our work at Boulder Crest that we do with military veterans and first responders. Um, their symptoms decrease over time in very significant ways as they experience post-traumatic growth. And as you help people develop their narrative, the story of their life, refer to those domains of post-traumatic growth. See where that is starting to show up, and offer the stories yourself or others to illustrate this possibility of change. And then people can be on a mission of service that allows them to find again purpose and meaning in their lives. Um, because what's purposeful and meaningful is not to just to figure out your life, but to invest in being of help to others and to benefiting other people. And these are things that can help a person withstand future challenges. These kinds of missions that I have something important to do. And these are now missions that can be derived from trauma experiences. Because I've been through what I've experienced, I need to reach out and help other people who've been through similar circumstances. So helping people find ways to be altruistic is important. So serving others, identifying a life mission is one of the fruits of trauma that we find in post-traumatic growth. I want to remind you that in working with Boulder Crest, um, we we are able to offer a lot of resources which help people understand post-traumatic growth and move through what I've just described to you. So we have books that we have published, the Post-Traumatic Growth Workbook, which is a way of kind of guiding people through this process. It's got a lot of exercises in it, ways of um, testing yourself, using some of those inventories that we developed in research to understand where you are in that post-traumatic growth process. So it can be used as a self-help book or guided by another expert companion or mental health person. And we also have published a book called Transformed by Trauma. These are stories of post-traumatic growth that are included in the book. And in those stories, we we describe then the post-traumatic growth process that we can see in the stories. And this book has been translated into Ukrainian, and we have those copies that are available to you in the Ukrainian translation. So we are proud to offer that. And this is a way of learning about post-traumatic growth through the words, the stories, the experiences of the people that we have served and learned to appreciate and respect in our work at Boulder Crest. We also have a resource center at Boulder Crest that you can go to, which includes all kinds of videos, articles, and information about post-traumatic growth, our work at Boulder Crest with military veterans and first responders, and all kinds of information that's applicable not only to those groups, but to anybody who has experienced traumatic circumstances. And we also have developed for mental health professionals a certification process in post-traumatic growth. So this is a course that you can take. It will probably take you about 15 hours to get through the course. It's video-based, and you can then, if you're a mental health professional, a licensed mental health professional, take this course and be certified in post-traumatic growth treatment. So you'll see videos that I've created at Boulder Crest, and a lot of information that we have in our resource center that's offered to you here. And if you want to scan the QR code and then use the coupon that we see here, you can take the course for no cost. It is usually $199 for the course, but this coupon code, if you use it, will allow you to take it for free. So that's a way to learn better how to operate as a post-traumatic growth mental health professional. So if you have training in mental health and you are a practicing provider of mental health services, this might be of interest to you so that you can adopt a post-traumatic growth way of doing your practice. And I hope that will benefit you as well as the people that you serve, because I have to tell you that practicing from this perspective has allowed me to hear many stories of trauma and to keep my hope and my respect for trauma survivors over all the years I've done this work. And it has kind of sustained me taking this kind of perspective, a hopeful perspective on what people can do. And I think this will help you if you are working with people who are suffering terrible things, to see what's possible and to help them move in the direction of post-traumatic growth. So with that, I hope that if you have some questions or comments, we've got some time now for some discussion, and I imagine we'll need perhaps some help with translation or whatnot in doing that. But I'm open to any kinds of questions or comments that you'd like to make in the time we have left.
Thank you, Rich. Just while people are thinking of their questions, you could put them on the chat, or if you want to, you can unmute and ask your question. But Rich, you mentioned how valuable stories are and how important it is for us to open up and communicate with people in our community. It's now going to help me be a better listener when I go to the Ukraine or communicate to people in the Ukraine. It's going to make me hopefully a better listener to hear what they're saying, hear their stories. Is there some story about some person you've worked with that is especially hopeful, inspiring, or that you would like to share while people are thinking of their question?
Well, you know, Steve, if I go back to the very beginning of this work, On the first page of the first book we wrote about this back in 1995, I tell the story of a person that I interviewed as part of a research program on post-traumatic growth. And this was a young man who in his mid-20s was paralyzed in a motor vehicle accident. And he told me that it was the best thing that ever happened to him. And that was kind of a shocking thing to hear. But I was coming to understand what people were telling me in these stories as he explained to me that what happened was that he was not living life particularly well when he got into this accident and became paralyzed. And, and what happened to him was um, in the rehabilitation center, working with the doctors, one of the doctors said to him, you know, you're going through this rehabilitation better than some of my other patients. I wonder if you could just sit with some of these other fellows and talk with them and listen to them and kind of, I think it could be helpful. And he did that. And he started to think that this was a very meaningful experience for him. And he had never done anything like that before. So he decided to go back to school. And he eventually got a degree in rehabilitation counseling. And when I met him, he was in his early 30s and he was a director of an agency that served disabled people and helped them find ways to get their homes adapted and modified so they could stay in their homes even though they had some severe disabilities. And he said, I would never have been living this life, doing these things that I now find so meaningful and important if I hadn't had that accident and ended up in the hospital paralyzed myself. So for him, this was something that turned his life in a direction that was very meaningful and purposeful and important. So that's why he said, this is the best thing that could have happened to me. Now, not everybody thinks about trauma that way because traumas are terrible things. This is terrible suffering. So we don't say that traumas are good things, despite what he said about his. But in the aftermath of trauma, where we focus our attention, you can do something that makes sense in terms of living life well and most meaningfully. And that's where we focus our attention. Not on the trauma itself so much, but what now? What next? What kind of future?
Dr. Tedeschi, I believe Marta is raising her hand.
Yes.
Доброго дня, дуже рада бути в цьому приємному середовищі. Мене звати Марта Пивоваренко, я психолог-психотерапевт, працюю з ветеранами з 2014 року. І хочу бути впевнена, що переклад працює, і я можу продовжити, так? Окей, добре. Я маю історію схожу на посттравматичне зростання. Один з моїх клієнтів, його родина проходила реабілітацію. Він втратив обидві руки і око під час того, як викидував гранату. Таким чином врятував кілька своїх побратимів, себе, але, звичайно, провів дуже тривалий період в лікарні без того, щоб бути впевненим, що він виживе. Його на той момент колишня дружина була з ним. Звичайно, що в неї після цього розвинулася депресія, бо вона щодня бачила, як значно молодші чоловіки вмирають в тій же ж палаті, а він з значно важчими втратами продовжує жити. Кілька разів він вмирав на цьому ліжку, але його таки врятували. З 2014 року, коли він отримав поранення, він почав писати книжки, дуже з гумором, так, деколи жартує, що якби міг накласти руки на себе, то наклав би, але немає рук. Отакий в нього гумор. Зараз, після тривалого відновлення, реабілітації, він вже мав в досвіді службу на позиції заступника міністра у справах ветеранів. А зараз, після повномасштабного вторгнення, я продовжую його стимулювати, допомагати іншим. І ми зараз з ним ведемо проект «Я зміг і ти зможеш», де він своїм прикладом надихає інших ветеранів, як можна облаштувати свою побутову незалежність, робити звичайні побутові речі, але самостійно. Тобто він всі функції відшліфовує, відтреновує, і ми потім записуємо це на відео, робимо такі відеоуроки. Це такий для мене приклад посттравматичного зростання. Єдине, що до сьогодні я не мала шансу поміряти його посттравматичне зростання, тепер, сподіваюся, буду мати таку нагоду. Це перша частина, просто такий приклад, який мене надихає рухатися в цьому напрямку пошуку посттравматичного зростання. А друга частина – це буде запитання до доктора Тедескі. Ми зараз із колегами з Гарвардського університету робимо невеличкі дослідження на деокупованих територіях. Ми допомагаємо навчитися рятувальникам, працівникам передової працювати з дітьми після окупації, і також вимірюємо їхнє психічне здоров'я, щоб розуміти, який вплив їхнє здоров'я може мати на допомогу. Бо ми можемо розраховувати на те, що така виснажлива робота по порятунку інших людей може провокувати вигорання. І цей термін емпатійне вигорання, він є теж достатньо новий, але він для нас зрозумілий. Результати нашого дослідження були протилежними. Ми побачили, що на відміну від наших очікувань, що ця група буде мати високий рівень вигорання, ми помітили, що рівень їхнього вираження ПТСР, депресії, anxiety нижчий, ніж загальна популяція людей. Тобто десь 6% лише цієї групи мають симптоми ПТСР, депресії, тривожного розладу, що нас здивувало. Тому ми припустили, що, можливо, те, що ми не поміряли, це якраз посттравматичне зростання. Єдине, що в нас буде питання, як вибудувати зараз це дослідження, так, щоб це виміряти. От таке запитання до доктора Тедескі. Дякую дуже. Сподіваюся, все було легко перекласти.
Well, I guess I'll need a bit of translation to understand what kind of response I can help with here.
Dr. Tedeschi, if you press the interpretation button and hit English, our interpreter was interpreting simultaneously. I apologize.
Oh my goodness.
Get
I
the
am so
opportunity.
sorry.
Yeah, Ostap, if you don't mind, could you summarize what Marta was saying real quick for Dr. Tedeschi? I apologize.
Okay.
Підкажіть, чим я можу допомогти? Мені це все перекласти на англійську зараз? Я можу спробувати.
Yeah.
Дякую дуже. Вибачте.
Maybe we could get another question until the interpretation and the summary of Marta's comment was could be arranged.
Dr. Orton as well, for everyone on the call, if you are an English speaker, if you'll please go down to the interpretation button on the bottom of the toolbar and hit the word English. Ostap is simultaneously translating right now, and you will hear her summary. Thank you. Oh, stop, you can proceed.
Okay, so let me respond to this, okay? Because one of the things that we have found, which I think Marta has spoken to here, is something we call vicarious post-traumatic growth. And that is among people who are helping trauma survivors in various ways, they sometimes report that their work is become so meaningful, and um, they have found that their way of being able to be of assistance to trauma survivors is so important to them that it changes them for the better as well. Um, so this may be something that Marta is talking about in these first responders who are helping these children. So we have been doing some research on this too, to understand this, and we have ways of measuring this. In fact, right now, we are preparing an article on this that we will be publishing soon, we hope, um, on the people that work for us at Boulder Crest, who are our peers. There are first responders and service members themselves who help people coming through our programs, and they report um, their own growth experiences as a result of being the guides in our program. So this is very surprising to some people, but we're not surprised. um, because the whole idea of being of service and benefiting others and helping others um, bolsters people's spirits and allows them to be courageous in how they live their lives. And I think this may be part of why people are doing such difficult work and confronting things that are so horrific may at the same time find themselves living well and being, I'll just have a sense of how purposeful and meaningful their lives are, and taking pride in that. So so that's important. The other thing is people who are doing this kind of work, if they're going to have that kind of experience, they need support. They need to be working for organizations that allow them to do their best work and to support them through the terrible parts of this work. So it's very important to have organizations around them who respect them and allow them to do their best work.
Thank you, Dr. Tedeschi. I'm going to call on someone named iPhone SE 2020.
перепрошую, я постійно забуваю, що мій телефон чомусь пише себе замість мене. Мене звуть Ліана, я психолог.
Okay.
Та, ви мене чуєте. Гаразд. Я хотіла би питання, котре стосується до Мартиного. Чи може бути так, що люди, котрі пережили самі травму, можливо, важку травму, але в даний момент зайняті важливою роботою служіння іншим і почуваються через те добре, бо вони зайняті важливою роботою? Чи може бути таке, що симптоми їхнього посттравматичного стресового розладу просто проявляться опісля, пізніше, коли вони перестануть робити цю роботу? Чи, можливо, ваш досвід з довгий досвід з травмою підказує навпаки, що люди переживають свою травму під час служіння іншим, і симптомів не з'являється ніколи?
Okay. Thank you for the question. I think it's an important one. If people are experiencing post-traumatic growth and they're learning how to live well and live in a way that has a great deal of purpose and meaning for them, it is unlikely they're going to later develop post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Post-traumatic growth seems to be a way of buffering against later symptom development. That's what our research shows. And post-traumatic growth can be a sustainable experience over time. But of course, everybody is different, and things can happen in people's lives that create additional stresses and suffering in the future. So we can't be sure about any particular individual, but generally, people who are set on a course where they're living lives according to any or more of these 5 domains of post-traumatic growth, they do better. And they become, in a sense, more resilient. We talk about resilience. Resilience is kind of an outcome of post-traumatic growth in a way. So they understand life better, they live it better, they understand their point and purpose in living, and that protects them in some ways, protective mechanism when an additional suffering or trauma might enter their lives in the future. So my prediction is that these people who are reporting post-traumatic growth will do better in the future over a long period of time. And again, I want to also emphasize that people who experience post-traumatic growth still can experience distress, symptoms. It doesn't make life all better. Things are still hard. And they still have to deal with those hard things and even some symptoms of PTSD, but they're much reduced and better able to be tolerated because life is meaningful.
Thank you,
Well,
Dr.
I think
Tedeschi.
we're getting to the end of the time that I'll be able to spend with you today. And I know that there are many other questions that you might have, and I notice in the chat there are quite a few. I invite you to get in touch with me through Boulder Crest, and you can send me questions you might have or comments. I'd be happy to try to respond to those things. And I know we are also planning, Steve and Lena, we're also planning on having another presentation with a person that we are very excited to send to you to discuss more of these kinds of issues, Charlie Plum. And so hopefully a lot of the questions and comments you have, we might be able to deal with at another time.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Tedeschi. We will certainly be communicating with everyone about future events. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.